Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Eggleston, and I run Course Report, which is a resource for students who are choosing a coding bootcamp or a data science bootcamp. If you haven't used Course Report yet, this is my one shameless plug of the video. We have thousands of alumni reviews, Q&As with students and instructors, and everything that you need to make a decision about the right coding bootcamp for you. So because of my work with Course Report, I have talked to tons of data science bootcamp graduates over the years, and most bootcampers are going to a data science bootcamp with the goal of getting their first job as a data scientist when they graduate. And that's most likely going to be a junior level job, maybe like a data analyst or a junior data scientist, maybe even an apprentice or another kind of entry level job. And that first job is definitely a milestone, one milestone in a very successful data science career. But today I am joined by two graduates of Metis, which is a data science bootcamp in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Seattle. Emily and Haley, who are on a call with us today, and they both actually graduated from the same class and have now been in the real world working as data scientists for a couple of years in San Francisco. Their careers have grown, and we are going to catch up with them to find out what happens after you graduate from a data science boot camp. So if you have questions about how you'll keep growing as a data scientist after you land that first job, stay tuned, and we're going to cover it all. So Emily and Halle, thank you so much for joining us. We know that you were both graduates of Metis, but could you introduce yourselves and just tell us what you were up to before you decided to attend Metis?
Sure. So I'm Emily, and I'm a data scientist at DrivenData. And before Metis, I was working as a research assistant out at Stanford. I had done my master's in international development, and so I'd been working in policy research for a few years, first at the Brookings Institution out in DC, and then out at the Stanford Center for International Development. And so my work was largely in this economic development space, and so I'd been working with data, but the economist tool of choice for that is Stata. It's not Python. So I was familiar with data and running some regressions and thinking about communicating results, but I didn't have any of the CS background. I taught myself Python like a few months before applying to Metis. And so I basically was on this kind of research track and decided that I didn't want to do a PhD, but really loved working with data and felt like I was pretty limited in the sort of data that I could work with. And so I wanted to go to Metis to essentially fill in that gap.
Amazing. Halle, did you come from a similar background, or what were you up to beforehand?
So before I went to Metis, I had been working in environmental consulting for three and a half years. I got my master's in environmental engineering. So I was doing engineering consulting for a company that did pretty like analytics heavy work. So I was doing a lot of data analysis, and I was really happy doing that. But I sort of had this consistent feeling that there was more insights that we could extract from the data that we were working with that, like, you know, we at the company that I was at didn't really have the skills to do. And honestly, the whole industry didn't really have the skills to do. It wasn't really a thing anyone was doing. So I decided to go to Metis to be the person who learned how to do that.
And when you were both kind of researching and thinking about making that, or kind of upskilling, since you were both working in data before, did you research or consider any other data science boot camps, and how did you end up choosing Metis?
I could start, I guess. I did do some research on other programs. The reason that I ended up picking Metis was, I think threefold. The first was that I was looking for something with the correct, how would I put this, sort of vibe is kind of a squishy word, but let's go with that. You know, sort of I had come from academic institutions that were very driven and very intense. And, you know, I obviously had no issue with driven and intenseness, but I really personally believe that the way that you learn is not by like killing yourself with the amount of like volume of stuff that you're trying to cram in. Like, you need rest and you need food. And like, I wanted an institution that understood that actually you learn more when you have a balance in your life. So I wasn't looking for an institution that was trying to sell me on how hardcore their program was, because I didn't really feel like I had anything to prove in that respect. And so that was one point in favor of Metis. The second and third ones really was, I really felt when I talked to the people at Metis, like they were interested in their students as individuals, not as numbers to churn through some sort of like success report. And so like at the time when I wanted to go back into environmental, I really felt like Metis was interested in supporting me and my career goals rather than just trying to shoehorn me into whatever program would make their thing look the best. So yeah, that was why.
Emily, did anything else stand out about Metis to you in your research process other than the things that Halle said?
Yeah, so I read some interviews with Jason Moss, and I really liked that he talked about validating the characteristics of people and how that like things like having like perseverance, like being persistent, having grit, having curiosity, having those things really matter in terms of being a good data scientist. And so it, to me, feels like it matters more how you deal with what you don't know than what you know, just in general. And so I like this focus on like, do you have those skills to really learn and to keep learning? And less, do you check the boxes in terms of like having this set of knowledge before coming in?
Did y'all both visit the Metis classroom before you made your decision? Halle, you mentioned like looking for a vibe, which is tough to tell online. Like, did you go to an info session or something like that where you met people?
I did, and actually I was lucky enough to get one of the info sessions that Jason was presenting himself. So I did kind of get the same perspective as Emily got about sort of Metis's values as a program. Yeah, I think it was really beneficial.
Cool. Okay, so Halle, you mentioned that you were thinking of going into back into the environmental field after you graduate. Could y'all both just kind of like rewind with me for a second? It's been a little while since you went to Metis, but think about your goals as you were applying to Metis. Like, you had both worked with data before, but I kind of found your limits with data in your past careers. What did you think was going to be your outcome after graduating? Where do you think you'd end up?
So I actually thought that I'd go back to working at Stanford. I'd actually taken a leave of absence from my job because my expectation was that I would come back into a role that was kind of a hybrid of research and data science. So some of my role at Stanford was writing pieces for the website that kind of communicated the findings from research. So I thought I could pull in that data visualization knowledge to help with that communication, or potentially work with some more interesting data sets if they were available. And so it was actually that, like, delving into data science at Metis where I found that I just loved what I was doing. And I was like, man, I just really wanted to do this full time. And I think about halfway through Metis, it kind of hit me that's like, hey, I think I'm actually learning enough that I don't have to go back into this hybrid role. Like, if I want to do this full time, I can just go and apply for those jobs. So that's what I did.
Yeah, I definitely, as I said, I envisioned myself going back into environmental consulting as an industry. And that's actually what I did do. That was my first role out of Metis, was data science for an environmental consulting firm. So yeah, I definitely sort of had this vision of bringing those skills that I learned in the program back to the industry I came from.
You like seriously met that vision.
I did do that thing, yes.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So I don't want to talk too much about necessarily the curriculum and like exactly what you learned at Metis, because actually I'm sure that the curriculum has changed somewhat since you graduated. But the Metis curriculum covers, kind of what you would expect from a data science bootcamp: Python and machine learning, databases, SQL. When you graduated from Metis, what did you feel most confident in, and what did you feel like you learned at Metis that you didn't know before? Did you feel like you graduated with skills that you didn't have working in data beforehand?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like everything I knew about machine learning when I graduated, I learned at Metis. Like I didn't have that CS background coming in. I mean, even just the code that I could write at the end of Metis was drastically different from like that knowledge going in. In terms of like the thing that I felt most confident doing at the end of Metis was probably just like that day-to-day bread and butter work of data science, of like cleaning and munging data, doing some exploratory plots, doing some feature engineering, running a random forest, like just that kind of standard, like through the pipeline, get the data in, run a simple model, get the results. And that stuff I think is actually like still like the bread and butter of a lot of things that I do now. And so that's great, because that was the sort of stuff that I was able to just like start using pretty soon into the job.
Cool.
Yeah, I would say I don't have a ton to add other than what Emily already said. Like I think that similarly, like all the machine learning that I know, I learned at Metis. Yeah, I think like one of the skills that I felt most confident in coming out of Metis was picking the correct algorithms for the problem at hand, like being able to identify sort of the pros and cons of different types of things and like what characteristics would be most applicable to the problem, things like that. And also sort of the end-to-end nature. I think that was one of the things that I really liked about Metis, was that we did end-to-end projects the whole time. And so, being able to just pick up a project and say, okay, here's a bunch of like dirty data, like let's get it cleaned, let's get it into a model, so on and so forth. Definitely, I think that I was grateful that I didn't end up just knowing a bunch of piecemeal, like vertical segments of the process.
Cool. Yeah, I think that is important. When I get questions a lot that are like, I've worked with data in the past, or I like work with Excel a ton in my job, and why do I need to go to a boot camp? Why can't I just teach this stuff to myself? But it sounds like the kind of boot camp structure of Metis kind of took like introduced concepts that you would not have kind of learned on your own. So that's,
I think there's also just like something really different, at least for me, about like having some of that time pressure on, right? Of having like 2 weeks for a project and like having that expectation that for me was just harder to like keep on myself if I was just doing this like in my free time, right? Like I did manage to teach myself like basic Python concepts over a few months, but like I learned stuff so much faster. And it just felt, I don't know, it just felt easier to be able to like rely on somebody else to have already done a lot of that curriculum development to like distill concepts to like help teach them to you versus just like, there's the internet, so like go out there. And some people learn differently, but like for me, that just, I feel like was really different than trying to do it myself.
For sure. Okay, so Halle, you mentioned that you actually went back into the environmental field after you graduated from Metis. How did you get your first job after Metis, and what were you working on?
I had actually been in touch with the company that I ended up at before I applied to Metis. It was when I was planning on moving to San Francisco, it was one of the places that I was looking. And at that point, I was looking for just a standard environmental engineer position. And so when I decided to go to Metis instead, after I graduated, I reached back out to them and I was like, hey, would you like a data scientist instead? And it turns out that they got back to me in like under 24 hours and they were like, yes, please come in for an interview. So that kind of fell into my lap that way, which was nice. What did I work on? I was handling a lot of the pipeline ETL for ingesting their data and getting it into a usable form. A fair bit of what I would call database engineering rather than data science, and occasional like analyses, sort of more traditional data science analyses, and then a lot of visualizations, a lot of data presentation.
So in your case, it was kind of like your past career and past background combined with those data science skills are like what got you into that first job.
In terms of what?
You had like some kind of background and like expertise in the environmental field. So it's cool that you went back into that world.
I leveraged my experience in that for sure in order to get that job.
Okay, we have a fire truck going by. I'll let that pass. Emily, what was your first job after you graduated from Metis?
My first job was at the Gates Foundation. I was a data scientist on their agriculture team, and I was actually the first data scientist on that team. And so that, I think I didn't appreciate that going in or didn't know how unique of a position that is. So the work actually was a lot of earlier level work, so like trying to get the data in place. And because there's a lot that has to be done in terms of like getting the data all in one place and like making it play nicely together before you can actually get to some of those higher levels of analysis. So I actually ended up doing a fair amount of pretty basic data stuff in terms of like simple plots and things, because they'd hired me as a data scientist, but didn't actually have some of those like earlier level, just like data analysts or business intelligence people in place. So I ended up doing a fair amount of that role.
Got it.
Yeah, that was something that I forgot to add also. I was additionally the first data scientist at my company. Not only in the office of my company, but in the entire multinational, multi-thousand people version of my company.
That is insane.
That's intense.
This, looking back, do either of y'all recommend that kind of path, taking a job as the first data scientist at a company? Not to make a comment on your first jobs or anything, but like, do you think that that's a good job for somebody that just graduates from a boot camp?
I think.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I think it depends on the company. So there's first of all, if you like database engineering, if you like ETL work, then absolutely do that thing because you will be a lifeline and everyone will love you forever. Really, honestly, in order to do data science, you need data. And if you don't already have the data and the infrastructure to sort of have the data in a usable form, then that needs to happen first before you can ever do anything with the data. And so, you know, you could maybe be the first data scientist at a startup and end up doing like a very small startup and end up doing a much wider range of things. But if you're the first data scientist at a large company that already has a bunch of like stuff that they're doing and a bunch of like data that needs to be pulled into a usable format and what have you, you're going to end up doing a lot of pipelining work. Which is for some people, absolutely. Wasn't really exactly what I was looking for. So I think that would be a question that I would ask if somebody wanted to be the first data scientist at a place to figure out what kind of work you would be doing. A good question to ask would be, do you have any database engineers? What's the status of your ETL and pipelining?
Gotcha. Emily, what were those job interviews like for you right after you graduated from Metis? How did they go? What was your experience like doing job interviews as a data scientist for the first time?
So it differed by place. So I interviewed with a startup that was working in like education technology, and they had their chief data scientist. And so that interview was pretty standard in terms of like you have your phone screening, you take home, you discuss that in interviews, you talk to everybody at the company. But the interview for the Gates Foundation was pretty different because since I was the first technical hire, the interviews were a lot less technical, right? I didn't actually do a coding challenge for that interview. And part of that was because of what they valued in that position. They cared a lot about subject matter expertise as well. So the fact that I could speak the language of agricultural development and then also be able to translate some of those concerns into data was really relevant. But I do think looking back that in some ways that's like a bit of a red flag because as Halle was saying, which I totally agree with, like the question to ask when you're interviewing for first data scientist position is like, who are the other data people and like, what are they currently doing? So you can understand, am I filling in for a position that they don't have yet? Or am I getting to like build on something that they've already been putting in place?
That's fantastic advice. Are either of you still with the company that you started with after Metis?
I am not.
No, of course, because your careers obviously grow. So let's talk a little bit about your kind of career and resume. How has that grown since you graduated? And have you moved jobs or gotten a promotion? What has your career looked like in the last year and a half, 2 years? Halle, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I spent about a year at the first job that I was at. And then I decided that I would really like to move to a place where there was a bit more sort of a place with other data scientists, basically, a bit more mature data science program and some a set of best practices for doing data science in an effective way. And that was actually some advice that I got from like an industry mentor that I reached out to. She recommended if you want to learn how to do data science well on your own, you need to know what problems are normal and what problems are not. And because some problems are just kind of inherent to what you're doing at a job, and some problems like indicate something's wrong. And to know the difference between those problems, like you have to go somewhere that's functional and knows how to do data science. So that was what I did, and I think it was great advice, and so I'm passing it along. I currently work for Lyft on their data science team, which was the role I got a couple months ago.
Amazing. And Emily, what are you up to now?
So last April, I switched jobs and I'm now a data scientist at a small company called DrivenData, and continue to work in like this intersection of international development and data science, which has been kind of a theme throughout. So at DrivenData, we work exclusively in like the for good space, meaning that we work with like nonprofits and international institutions like the World Bank that have interesting data sets, but may not yet have that technical expertise in-house to really bring like the power of data science to some of those like big societal problems that they're working on.
Halle, you mentioned that you had a mentor or business mentor that kind of guided you in your career. Emily, did you have someone similar, or was Metis kind of filling that role for y'all at any point after you graduated, or how do you kind of like get advice from the community?
So I had a great chat with a Metis instructor, actually, just kind of by happenstance. I was doing like a Q&A webinar about Metis, and afterwards we got to talking. And she had been the first data scientist at cars.com and had built out that team. And so it was really helpful to talk to somebody else that had been a first data scientist and try, as Halle said, like so well put about like what problems are normal, what problems are not normal. And I think helped me look at like what are some of the structural things that are in play, and like is the structure set up in a way that like if I put in my time that I can really build a team, or is this just like a situation in which if I stick around for 2 more years, I'm probably going to be in a similar boat. So it was really helpful just to like talk with her and hear about her experience and try to figure out how that applied to my decision to stay or leave.
I feel like it sounds like you've both done a really good job kind of learning and being like very cognizant of the types of jobs and teams that are best for you as data scientists. Because like you were saying, you could probably spend 2 or 3 years in a job, but I love that you've moved into roles that like had teams that you could tell that you needed. That is kind of great advice for anybody that's going through a boot camp. So aside from resume changes, how do you both feel like you've grown and kind of changed as a data scientist over the last 2 or 3 years? Like, do you think you've become a quote unquote better data scientist as the years have gone by?
I think that for one, my code has just gotten so much better. Like it's just like cleaner and like more efficient. Like there's all these like style conventions that I didn't know until I joined my current team. And like it sounds silly, right? Like I mean, my boss would like painstakingly like point out like the spaces after equal signs that weren't supposed to be there in like code reviews, but it really helped me like internalize these norms for writing good code. And so now like when I look at my code, I just think, wow, this is so different, right? But like when you're going through Metis, you're just like, you're doing the best you can, but like I didn't have a background in that. And so you're kind of doing like whatever way works. And so it's cool to have that knowledge now where you're like, oh, I know that this is going to be like a better way, or I have this complicated thing. And I think I know what function to write to achieve that.
I think that the biggest, so certainly there was a point when I was preparing for interviews for my second round of interviews after leaving Metis, where I went back and did a bunch of the early sort of challenges, redid them that we got at Metis. And there was one that I remember just bashing my head against forever and ever and ever. And I went back and did it again. And I was like, oh, this was the hard one. Like, this will get me a lot of practice for these interviews. And I like sort of banged it out in like half an hour. And I was like, wait, that wasn't the way it went the first time. And I think that was a really good marker of sort of how far I'd come. To be honest, personally, I feel like the bigger change has been in my own confidence. And my sort of my current role, one of the things I really love about it is that it's for a data-driven company. And so the product and engineering teams look to data to help make their decisions. And so I think that that's really given me a voice and the confidence to use that voice in a way that I didn't really have before.
What are you both working on like day to day? Obviously, you don't have to give up anything confidential, but can you just talk a little bit about what you're actually like doing as data scientists now? It's
actually pretty much like the one sentence summary of what I just said. Is I work with the product and engineering teams and sort of help them make really good decisions and sort of guide their roadmaps in a data first kind of way.
And like, what are you working on day to day now? Yeah, that is right.
So being at a small company and also kind of as a consultancy, it means that we get to work across a whole bunch of different like subject matter areas. So my work thematically is really in a bunch of different places. I've been on projects for like financial health, as well as like energy efficiency work, as well as like conservation work. We've been doing stuff around identifying animals in camera trap videos. And so it's in each of those instances, a similar workflow, kind of what you'd expect from a data scientist, right? Where we have a data set and there's, some sort of modeling that needs to happen and all the pieces that come before and after that, with everything kind of tracked in GitHub issues. So it's a pretty standard piece, but it's a lot of fun because you have that exposure. And I think that that's also like plays into like what we were just talking about in terms of like growing as a data scientist, of just like seeing that different types of data, right? And continuing to like have different problems where you end up like researching a new method or like figuring out how to do things with video data or things like that.
Have you, do y'all feel like as you become more kind of mature data scientists that you are like specializing? Do you see that being kind of a trend in the data science industry, that like as people spend more time in it, they become kind of more interested in like machine learning or like something very specific in data science? Or do you kind of see yourself staying general?
Certainly. So one thing that can be really valuable is subject matter expertise, right? Like any subject matter expertise you have is going to really give you an edge in working on those kind of problems, because it just like, if you're developing solutions for an area that you have zero subject matter expertise in and haven't managed to pick any up, you're not going to create any solutions that are worth anything. Like you're just going to create nonsense. And I've seen that happen before, where you bring in someone who just has absolutely a great background in computers, like a fantastic, data scientist, absolutely no knowledge of the subject matter, and like they end up creating something that no one can use. And so certainly any people recognize the value of that kind of expertise. So specializing to that extent is helpful. And then there's like just things that you get interested in that you kind of start to work more on. But I don't know that that's necessarily a thing that that you really, really focus in on in the first couple of years, or at least I haven't. I think that that's more of like a 5 to 10 year career horizon kind of thing.
Well, Emily, sorry, did you have something to add?
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, I think somewhat similarly, I don't feel like I've specialized, but there are like certain things that I tend to find myself doing less of. So it's almost like a reverse specialization. And so like there are, like I've never been in a situation where I've had like actual big data where I've needed to use something like Hadoop. And so I don't really have the skill set for that. And then like in development, we just don't have data set that merits that. I also don't tend to do a lot of NLP just because there tend to be less data sets for that in the space that I'm in.
So like if you compare your first job interviews after graduating from Metis to like maybe your second round of job interviews when you're getting your second job and the job that you have now, how did those change? Do you feel like you got more confident as you went on? Like, did it feel the exact same? Like, for somebody who's about to like become a data scientist after a boot camp, what can they expect from like the first round of job interviews versus their second round or third round?
It depends on, so my first round of job interviews was obviously very different from my second round because I was switching industries in the second round and wasn't in the first round. So I'm not sure that that's terribly helpful or applicable to anybody else. I would say in terms of what you're preparing for interviews, prepare for something that might be a little demoralizing. Like you're gonna interview with a lot of companies, and like most of the times you're not even gonna make it through the phone screen, and like that's okay and that's normal. There are a lot of companies out there, and sometimes it's just a numbers game. Sometimes you're just gonna get someone grumpy and having a bad day, and like that's not reflecting necessarily on your skills. Like you should obviously like take a look at your skills and make sure that you know you can answer the questions okay and stuff, but like sometimes you just get asked a weird question, and like I think just not taking that so very personally. The advice I got from somewhere online was that you should imagine up front that like you have a preordained number of days it's going to take to get your job. Right? Like you don't know what it's going to be. It could be 20, it could be 200, but there is a number. You're going to get a job on the other end. And your role is just to every single day, make that number go down by 1. That every day that you spend job hunting, every day you spend preparing, whatever is going to make that number go down by 1. And like, you're just going to roll with it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like I had a lot of imposter syndrome interviewing for my second job because I didn't feel like I was like fully utilizing all the stuff that I learned at Metis in my first job. And so like when I graduated from Metis, it was like, yeah, I like just built a UNet and like, you know, I've been like doing all of this like fancy modeling. And then over the next 6 months, I really didn't do machine learning. I was not really doing anything with models. And so then when I went to interview again, it was like this fear of like, did I forget this skill set, right? And I remember Andrew from Metis saying like, it hasn't been that long, like it's all still there. And it was, right? Like I had take homes and it's all there. But like, I think the thing that stuck out to me in the second job interview was just that I felt like people took me a little bit more seriously because I had already been hired once as a data scientist. And like, we had been told this, that like getting your second data scientist job is easier than your first. And I did find that to be somewhat true. Whether it should or shouldn't be, like, who knows? But I think that there is something about somebody has vouched for you, right? And like hired you. And so having that on your resume, I think it's just a good foot in the door. And so I think if I were to frame that as advice, I think it's more just like, it's okay to take that gamble on the first job. And if it's not quite right, you're still going to learn a lot about the things that you want in your next job. And so it helped me really target the companies that I wanted to work for and like the questions that I asked, because I knew the things that I valued, especially if they were things I didn't get the first time around. So yeah, it's like, it's okay to take a risk and to switch jobs to something else that you love.
Cool. At what point, I hear different answers to this question from different people, but at what point over the last 2 or 3 years did y'all truly feel like data scientists? Was it during Metis, like right after you graduated, were you like, oh, I'm a data scientist now? Or like where in your journey did you kind of think, oh, this is like my true career now?
Let's see. Maybe when I bought a 32-inch monitor for work, that made me feel pretty legit. No, great monitor though. But I think it was just the like noticing that like the bread and butter, like the programs that were like always open on my computer were Jupyter Notebooks and a terminal window and Sublime and like all the standard things that you'd expect. And like that just wasn't the case in my first job. And so having that just be so embedded into my job now, where I like go to work and I write code all day and like ideally close some GitHub issues, I think that's what made me feel like a data scientist.
Cool.
I have two completely diametrically opposed answers to this question. And I think this is the type of question that like deeply, deeply depends on where you're coming from. And people come from so vastly different angles on this thing. I think some people have a failure mode where they like never feel like a data scientist. And some people have a failure mode where they feel like a data scientist way too early. And so I don't want to give the wrong answer here, so I'm going to give both answers. I think that if you're sitting there being like, I will never be a data scientist, I'm not one now, I won't be one in the future, the answer is you're already a data scientist. And that was the answer that Andrew, the career advisor, gave me like second or third week in Metis when we went to some sort of networking event, and it said like, you know, for data scientists or whatever. And I was sitting there like, but I'm not a data scientist. How can I go to this networking event? And he was like, you're already a data scientist. You're going to this networking event. And I went to this networking event and everyone at the networking event was like, yeah, you're a data scientist. Like nobody batted an eye. So it might've been then. But I think that the opposite answer, the one like, if you feel like you haven't really ever worked in data science, but you're comfortable sort of taking on that role, I would say, you know, take a couple of years, like looking at the work that other people are doing, like you're standing on the shoulders of giants here, like figure out who those giants are and the work that they're doing, and like spend some time paying attention to what's already out there, or you end up reinventing the wheel a lot.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like a lot of both of your growth has come with practice and just like working in the field and becoming better by just knowing what you're doing. But if you're giving future data scientists advice, is there anything that you've actively done to kind of grow from junior to mid-level senior data scientists? Maybe like courses after you graduated, or finding a great mentor, or doing something with Metis again, or anything like that, anything that we could recommend for other grads?
So my answer, I don't know if this is going to be a helpful answer, but like one of the things that I feel like has helped me grow the most is having a team that does pair programming like regularly, and like sitting down with people, which yes, it's embarrassing at first because you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna like forget how to do things and they're gonna see me like make mistakes, but like you learn so much, even just these like little things. And so I feel like that's a question that I would ask in interviews, is like, is pair programming done, and like how often, and like how does that happen? Because it's just a really great way to like learn from other people's code and knowledge.
Emily, that's a really good idea, and I'm gonna go ask some of my coworkers if we can set this up. I was like making a mental note about that. Yeah, pursuing personal projects, especially if your first role isn't one where you feel like you're being able to utilize the full range of your skills. I spent a honestly pretty grueling couple of months doing a 40-hour-a-week job and then 20 hours a week of personal projects on the side, kind of preparing for my second round of interviews. And I think that that was hugely instrumental in not only having a great portfolio for people to look at, but also developing my skill sets for the interviews and just general confidence as a data scientist. So definitely that. Also, if you feel like you're getting something in interviews a lot that you don't really have a great background in, it's usually SQL maybe, to like brush up on those skills independently, that's what I'd say.
Cool. Well, I think that's amazing advice for, I guess, someone who's like getting into the industry. Before we wrap up, any advice for folks that are just about to start at a data science bootcamp like Metis? What should they like do for those 12 weeks what advice do you give friends that are about to start a boot camp?
Metis has a bunch of, so like I have actually referred a friend or two to Metis, and they have a bunch of prep work. And so I'm just like, do their prep work, just do all their prep work and everything will be fine. I recognize that's not helpful if you're not going to this particular boot camp. So I would say in that case, like if your boot camp has some, like ask them if they have some prep work that you can do. So anything that they recommend, I'm sure they'd be absolutely thrilled to like give you those resources. If that's not the case, I would say brushing up on Python, like a Python 101 course would be really helpful. And a lot of math and statistics. Like if you know your statistics backwards and forwards, you're gonna save yourself a lot of time later trying to kind of wrap your head around various ways that certain algorithms are behaving, so.
Very practical advice. That's awesome. Emily, anything you would add?
No, that was great. I think just like while you're like doing the bootcamp, I think that like we talked about getting through like the project, right? Going from like the messy data to like the thing that you can present on. And I remember some of the Metis instructors were really good at telling us to like table some of those moments when you're like, oh my God, I need to like bring in more data. I need to do more of this thing. And they were like, just get all the way through the pipeline. Then you can go back and add stuff, like document it, write it down. It's valid, but like you don't necessarily need to do it right now. And that like focus on just like getting that whole, like getting through that cycle is really helpful because I think that allows you to just learn a lot because you don't just get stuck in one area and is also like a skill that is helpful in practice afterwards.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Emily and Halle for joining us. I think your advice will be super helpful to anyone who's like about to embark on Metis or any other data science bootcamp, or someone who just wants to have a better understanding of what it takes to be really successful in this industry. So I appreciate you joining us. We will post a recording and a transcript of this webinar on our blog soon, and we will include information about Metis, which is the data science bootcamp that Emily and Halle went to. And thank you all for tuning in. Tweet at us, email us, let us know what you want to see us cover on the next course support webinar. Bye.